Welcome to Democracy and Dictatorship, a show where we've been exploring the power relations between the governing and the governed, and what that means for us all. Sitting in Asia, the recent shifts of power and allies has caught our attention, and the world's. The relationship between India and Pakistan is back on the boil. India's Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj recently asserted that it should be clear to Pakistan that Jammu and Kashmir is an integral part of India. India also questioned Islamabad's position when it came to existing terrorist havens in Pakistan. Islamabad responded by calling Swaraj's remarks a litany of falsehoods. The India-Pak struggle is not new, nor are the changing relations in the continent. Add to it the role the US plays in Asia, and you have cause for concern. India and US recently signed a bilateral defense deal. One could view that as a show of strength against China, and it definitely changes the playing ground in Asia. Since the end of the Cold War, alliances in Asia have shifted like tectonic plates. The region's growing economic strength is fueling old and new rivalries. Beyond's correspondent Giles Gibson takes a look at these power relations in Asia over the last 25 years.
November 1989. The Berlin Wall, a symbol of the divide between East and West, begins to be torn down. And as the Soviet Union falls soon after, power structures across the world start to shift. In Asia, China's ruling Communist Party had enjoyed strong links with Moscow, but the post-Cold War era gave birth to a new power structure in Asia. As the region's economies surged in the 1990s, BRICS countries like India and China found themselves with a new status on the global stage. But new power can create new rivalries. In Southeast Asia, China is pushing territorial claims in the disputed South China Sea. Moscow strongly backs Beijing, with Russia joining Chinese forces in naval exercises in the disputed waters in September. And in South Asia, old wounds can sometimes be as fresh as new ones. The recent Uri attack is pushing India-Pakistan relations to breaking point once again. And both countries' leaders aren't backing down.
For its part, Pakistan is committed to the establishment of strategic stability in the region. It neither wants nor is it engaged in an arms race with India. But we cannot ignore our neighbors' unprecedented arms buildup and will take whatever measures are necessary to maintain credible deterrence.
पाकिस्तान के हुक्मरान सुन ले, हमारे 18 जवानों का बलिदान बेकार नहीं जाएगा। भारत सफल रहा है पूरे दुनिया में आपको अलग थलग करने के लिए, और हम उसको तेज करेंगे और पूरे विश्व में आपको अकेला रहने के लिए हम मजबूर करके रहेंगे।
As Pakistan and India size each other up, regional powers will inevitably be drawn in. The China-Pakistan economic corridor passes directly through Balochistan, a source of fresh tensions between New Delhi and Islamabad. The BRICS countries climbed the global GDP tables together, fueled by unprecedented economic growth. The very word BRICS implies building blocks, strength, togetherness. But the group's Asian countries, India and China, are as much rivals as they are allies. And it's that rivalry between India and China which is set to dominate the future of Asia's power structures. Giles Gibson, WION, New Delhi.
The changing relations in Asia make it a great time for other regional powers to step in and forge new alliances. The Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement, or LIMOA deal, between US and India is an indication and telling sign of future possibilities. Where did it all start? WION decided to trace the deals between the two countries over the past few decades to where we are right now. Here's Ramesh Ramachandran with that story.
December 1971, the height of the Cold War. India is on the brink of a full-blown conflict with Pakistan to liberate Bangladesh. Indira Gandhi travels to Washington to seek Richard Nixon's understanding.
I am haunted by the tormented faces in our overcrowded refugee camps.
We are not bound together by a treaty commitment in the technical sense. But India and the United States are bound together by a higher morality.
The treaty Nixon was referring to is the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation signed by India and the then USSR 3 months before in the month of August. Declassified documents released decades later show Nixon harbored a distrust of India. A month after the Gandhi-Nixon meeting, war breaks out between India and Pakistan. India views it as an unfriendly act. July 2007, nuclear-powered American aircraft carrier USS Nimitz docks near Chennai for a friendly call at the invitation of the Indian government. These two incidents, which took place 3 decades apart, are illustrative and symbolic of the change in the nature of India's relationship with the United States. The governments headed by Indian Prime Ministers Atal Bihari Vajpayee, Manmohan Singh, and now Narendra Modi all have sought closer ties with the US, including in defense. Today, India conducts military exercises with the United States more than it does with any other country. Defense purchases have moved from almost zero to $10 billion in less than a decade. They include the purchase of Chinook heavy lift and Apache attack helicopters, aircraft such as P-8I maritime surveillance planes, C-130J Super Hercules, and C-17 Globemaster III in the transport category, and Harpoon missile systems. The US has emerged as the largest supplier of arms to India, but Russia remains by far the mainstay of India's defense portfolio.
All you have to do is juxtapose the kind of assistance the Russians have given to what the Americans are promising. What is America promising? Tactical drones, small little aircraft that in our younger days we used to fly as model airplanes, is some version of that. Is there any comparison?
Recently, India and the US signed the Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement, which will make it easier for the armed forces of the two countries to operate. India's defense relationship with the United States may have taken a long time coming, but they are acquiring a logic of their own. As Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi told the US Congress earlier this year, India and the US have overcome the hesitations of history. But how the American pivot or rebalance to Asia will influence or impinge upon India's traditional defense ties with Russia remains to be seen. Ramesh Ramachandran, WION, New Delhi.
Overcoming hesitations of history. India and US have managed to get to that. But where do they go from here? What does it mean for Asia? To answer all that and more, we have former US State Department official Anja Manuel and former Indian Ambassador S.D. Muni with us in studio. Stay with us for that after a short break. Welcome back to Democracy and Dictatorship. We've been seeing a realignment of military might and shifting of relationships when it comes to the US and Asia. The US has moved fast and has fostered new relationships, having a lasting impact on the region. To talk more about it, we have with us in studio Anja Manuel, a former US State Department official who has worked closely with Nicholas Burns and Condoleezza Rice. Anja has worked extensively on issues concerning Asia. Her recently released book titled The Brave New World focuses on the same. Also with us is Mr. S.D. Muni. He's now a distinguished fellow at the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis. He's also a former Indian ambassador who was India's special envoy to Southeast Asian countries as part of a UN mission. Thank you both for joining us. Let me start by asking you, Anja. The US has been helping India strengthen its military might in some ways. Tell us what kind of an impact it has had on the region, specifically looking at China and Pakistan.
First of all, thank you very much for having me here. I'm happy to be back in Delhi and happy to be here on your show. The partnership between India and the United States has progressed very rapidly, just like you said. 10 years ago, when I served in the United States State Department, we were just working to overcome what I think had been a relationship with a lot of mutual distrust. And partly through the civilian nuclear deal, which I had a small part in negotiating, we worked hard to promote the cooperative side of our relationship. It wasn't always easy. Those negotiations were really hard fought, and it wasn't clear that we were going to come out having a deal. But it has unlocked so much cooperation in other areas, including in defense, as you said. So now we exercise more with the Indian military, the United States does, than with any other military on earth. Our Secretary of Defense signed a logistics agreement with you, which is small. It's a small step, but it's an important step because it means that we can resupply our ships here in India and you can resupply yours in the United States. All of these things would have been unthinkable a decade ago. So I think they are positive developments. We need to be sure that as we are building our partnership between India and the US, we continue to hold out an open hand to China and to others who may be distrustful of these new, closer relations.
Mr. Muni, the logistical support agreement, which certainly was a big no-no for India for many decades now, so ever since the 123 agreement began. The Americans were very interested in it, but the Indians certainly distrusted the idea of Americans having access to ports, airports, and facilities here, even though there was, on the flip side, exchange for Indian military to have access to theirs. How difficult has this journey been for India to be able to go and actually sign the LSA?
Well, the idea was that such an agreement would conflict with India's concept of strategic autonomy. We have always believed in strategic decisions being taken without any other outside influence, and that's where the problem was. And you were saying distrust, I used the word trust deficit. And a lot of trust deficit has been bridged since 2000, particularly after, I would say, Kargil war. But there are hiccups. There are hiccups on the nature of US relationship with China and the nature of US relationship with Pakistan and the new role which the US has in Asia. This agreement has a lot of what you call stigmas attached to it. And therefore, India had in fact redefined this agreement. This agreement originally, and please correct me, is called LSA, the Logistic Support Agreement. Okay. We have made it into a very different name, and largely to underline the fact that India would have as many rights to the American bases or American facilities as America would have on Indian facilities. Therefore, it is made to appear that this is a partnership.
The relationship US has with Pakistan, it's gone through many twists and turns. The latest $300 million blockage of funds to Pakistan on the basis of the idea that they haven't done enough against terrorism. Do you think that will help curb terrorism in the region?
Well, there are two sides of this kind of a coin, because on the one hand you are referring to $300 million. On the other hand, US is still hesitating on doing much more to discipline Pakistan on the terrorism count. There are very powerful constituencies within the US which would stand by Pakistan for various reasons. I can just draw your attention to a very small incident. Eisenhower, when in 1958 came here, he did exchange views with the Indian leadership and told them that we do realize that the alliance which we have struck with Pakistan is very uncomfortable, but there is nothing we can do about it. So this is a realization going as back to 1958-59, and that dilemma in the American policy, I think, has persisted.
Anja, let me ask you, what was that really brought about this change? You were comfortably in bed with the Pakistanis, and the Chinese seemed to be very aligned. What was a change of heart to have this relationship with India for the United States?
It's interesting. I don't think we were ever comfortably in bed with the Pakistanis. I would argue that it is in the U.S. interest, in India's interest, and in the world's interest for Pakistan to be a stable, moderately prosperous country that is at peace. Since independence, since Pakistan became a state, we've had periods where we give high military aid. We've had periods where we haven't given any aid. After September 11th, we believed that we absolutely needed Pakistan for the war in Afghanistan because, frankly, our logistic supply lines had to move through there. So the decision was taken that we needed to have a relationship with them, and we gave a lot of aid. Now, of course, they're very comfortable with China. The relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan continues to be debated heatedly within Washington and even outside of it, and no one quite knows what the right answer is. But I think the answer is not to be entirely pro-India or entirely pro-Pakistan, and it is also not to hyphenate the relationship. So I'm very happy that we have independent and separate relations with both of these countries.
We're going to take another break right now, but stay tuned with us because when we return, we're going to talk more about India, US, and the global politics. Welcome back to Democracy and Dictatorship. We've been talking to Anja Manuel and S.D. Muni about the changing relations in Asia and the presence of the US. China has been a very interesting one for you, from the 40s, from where you took China along and creating the production lines and the factories there, to a point where there seems to be a lot of conflict between the United States and China at many levels. Where does that come from?
Well, it's amazing how the world shifts. So you mentioned the 1940s. Actually, in the 1940s, India, Britain, the United States were allied with China fighting against Japan. Now we're doing far more exercises, India, Japan, US, that are in a way because we're worried about a rising China. So boy, how quickly things shift in international relations. The relationship between China and the US right now is the most difficult that I've seen. And I think partly both sides are reacting to a bigger trend, which is that after 20 years, 30, 40 years of increased globalization, more open borders, freer trade, movements of people and goods, that has been good for the world, I would argue, but it has left a lot of people behind. China, as its economy slows down, is also in a bit of a defensive crouch. And I think some of the aggressiveness in the South China Sea and elsewhere is a reaction of nationalism because there are things internally that are problematic. And those two trends, and seeing it both in China and the US, makes for a very difficult relationship that we're going to have to manage carefully.
Mr. Muni, do you want to react to that?
Well, I would look at it very differently, and the US actually makes tactical alliances, not strategic alliances. Why I say that? Because you see a shift from allies to adversaries and adversaries to allies. And the Chinese have never made any hesitation in making it clear that they had nothing in common with the US except for the strategic or tactical aspect. There is a certain consistency in how they look towards the West. And this is where I said now the US is in a great dilemma of its own creation, what to do with China. Therefore, on the one hand, they don't want China to challenge the US hegemony in Asia for one reason or another. And secondly, US can't do without the cheap goods which are being produced by the Chinese and the economic interdependence which has absolutely robustly been built up between the two countries.
The Chinese economic journey is continuing to grow in many, many ways. If you look at the CPEC, the corridor that they're building, going towards Pakistan ahead, how does that all fit into our geopolitics, our economic geopolitics, if I may say so?
China is becoming the elephant on the world economic stage. And we are often asked, well, what's the US going to do about it? The answer is the United States, as a democracy, doesn't have the luxury that China has. China can coordinate state aid, what their state-owned enterprises are doing, government guaranteed loans, and create this type of economic juggernaut, like you see the 46 billion that's being promised to Pakistan and elsewhere. There is no way that a United States or an India could do that, because our companies invest where they think there are good economic opportunities, not where the government tells us to. We give aid hopefully in an altruistic sense, and we just don't have the coordinating mechanism that the Chinese do. I do think that the Chinese are beginning to voluntarily tie themselves into international institutions, like the creation of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB. I think that's actually a positive development.
In 2014, Chinese troops were seen training the Pakistani troops, and certainly a sign for the rest of the world to say, if the US does not continue partnering with Pakistan, then they will go the Chinese route. And if you see, a lot of their manufacturing is with them now, and certainly a large part of their weapons supplies come. What kind of a position does US come in when you see so much of Russia, Pakistan, China, Pakistan synergies happening?
It creates a dilemma for us, of course. I think in an ideal world, we wouldn't divide the world into hostile camps. And unfortunately, that is the shift that you're now seeing. And I would say to Mr. Muni, you pointed out rightfully that the US has the strategic dilemma. We're economically very dependent on China, but strategically it's becoming more and more a competitor. I would submit that India has exactly the same dilemma. So when we talk to our Indian friends about China, it's exactly the same views. We want to cooperate economically. We think trade benefits everyone, but strategically things are becoming more complicated. And having them training troops in Pakistan is certainly not something we would welcome. We hope that we can develop a world that's not entirely zero-sum. I think we're standing right at the cusp of deciding whether we want to go down a path of rivalry with China, or whether and it's both. It's not just the US can't decide this unilaterally. You need the Chinese to also decide whether they want rivalry or cooperation. You need India to decide how it wants to play in this tripartite dance. But I do think we have a choice to cooperate mostly, as opposed to just going down the path of rivalry and possibly another Cold War.
The realignments that we see. No, Mr. Muni, you want to say something?
No, I said I don't think the US has the choice. If you look at it from a different perspective, the problem is that the Chinese are challenging the US hegemony in Asia. There is absolutely no doubt about it. The US has to decide whether it is going to compromise on that, or it is not going to let China do what it wants to do strategically. You raised the question of Road and Belt Initiative. Now, Road and Belt Initiative, so long as to support the Chinese companies who are now idle because they have finished their, they have reached saturation point in their own infrastructure building. And therefore, this bank, 100 billion bank to support them, absolutely fine so far as it has only economic aspect, but it doesn't have an economic aspect. And this is where a lot of infrastructure will be used for strategic purposes. The problem has arisen because China wants to upset the apple cart everywhere. They are challenging the US, they are having territorial nationalism, which is worrying not only India, it is worrying all the Southeast Asian countries. And Americans will have to decide what they really want to do, either with their status in the world or what the Chinese are going to demand.
Can I add one point on this? Because I think you're right that the US has to decide, are we going to consistently confront Chinese policy in the South China Sea and the East China Sea? Are we going to stay engaged in Asia? You're talking from the military perspective, so we'll just stay on that. And I think the answer from the center, from the moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans, is definitely yes. I would add that the rest of the region also needs to choose whether you want America to be involved and whether you are willing to be supportive. Because unfortunately what happens a lot It's kind of the dilemma of being the big guy on the block. You get criticized when you participate and do something and you're active, and you get criticized if you pull back. So you've seen this in the Middle East, for example, with the Obama administration. The Bush administration was criticized for being very active in the Middle East, and the Obama administration is now being criticized for having pulled back and letting Syria solve its own problems. So we're seeing that also in the South and East China Sea. I think that the U.S. is going to continue to be engaged. I think you're right that that means there's going to be more conflict, but I hope that this wouldn't turn into a U.S. versus China strategic rivalry, but that it is a community of nations that supports the rule of law and land grab and opposes land grabs by any country.
What I see is ideologically, as long as you're aligned as nations, as people, then your alignment becomes a far more easier one to sell to your population. Also, it becomes easier for you to exist, because if you're ideologically in the same line, whether you're democracies or dictatorships or authoritarian regimes, it's far more easier to justify the engagement. And when it's not that's when the challenges come. Thank you, Anja, for joining us for this discussion. Thank you, Mr. Muni.
Thank you for having us.
The end of the Cold War made all nations available for realignments, but it has taken decades to re-establish these lines. It has also opened up the relationships to more scrutiny and made it evident that nothing is absolute.